Hello, welcome everyone to the final part of our lecture. We have already been through part one and part two of this class. So during the first 2 weeks, we were discussing a lot about what is international development as an idea, as an industry, and as a professional field, and what is sustainable development, what are the different goals, how do they measure sustainable development, and then we talk about the basic needs and capability approach, modernization theory and dependency theory and world system theory. And then we also talk about the criticism of sustainability, right? So we had an overview of all the major concepts being talked about at the global level. And then we proceeded to part two, which we really focused on talking about what are the causes of poverty at the ground level, right? Regardless of what was being discussed at the global level, how do people actually live at the ground level, right? So we talk about culture of poverty or culture of sustainability recently, following climate change and Anthropocene. And then we talk about the social positions, how social positions affects poverty, like gender, race, or other kinds of identities, right? And then we talk about urban and rural poverty, how poverty is manifested differently in the urban area and rural area, but they are all affected by national and global policies, which link us to the discussion on neoliberalization and economic inequalities. And we spend a whole lecture talking about what is neoliberalism, how does the idea arise, how is it being implemented globally, and what is its impact on lives on the ground, right? And then the last topic we had just before this, which is the last topic of part two, is talking about environmental inequalities and injustice, right? So I was hoping that by now you can see that there is some sort of remarkable gap between part one, which is the global understanding and the global debates on the different development theories, and also what is happening to people's life on the ground, right? And it seems to me that even though with many different indicators and index coming out of part one with the sustainable development goal, multi-dimensional poverty, it seems like there's still a lot of things they are not discussing about. Like, for example, maybe people are not undeveloped, but actually they are exploited because they are victims of development. This is similar to the dependency theory. So part three is, so how do we move forward when we are seeing such a gap between the global efforts and the things that are being pushed by the powerful actors and what's happening on the ground? So how do we address poverty and justice? So this is meant to be a more positive, hopefully, part of our class. But I have always tried to show that people have agency, and I never lose hope and think that this is the whole world of structural oppression and there will be no tomorrow. So I was hoping that I didn't project that at all, because I want to really highlight on people's agency. And part three, I want to talk about alternative ideas, like how people approach poverty and justice differently from what we have discussed in part one, right? So hopefully we can also generate a lot of discussion during this part three. And this week lecture, I'm going to actually focus on the idea of post-development and degrowth. Okay, so what are the alternatives to development, right? So see here, we are not talking about development alternatives. Here we are not talking about human development, participatory development, but we are actually going to discuss what are the alternatives to development. So I found this kind of funny cartoon online. Maybe it's not funny, maybe it's kind of accurate. So the first picture say then the rich people telling the poor people you need to reform, and then now is the poor people telling the rich people you need to reform. So I think this kind of capture some of the essence of what we want to talk about in terms of post-development. Okay, so post-development is actually an idea that is being shared in the intellectual circle and also some of the activist circles since the 1990s. So these are three of the landmark books I would call for post-developmentalists, but of course there are many more books that's being written on the subject with or without using the term post-development, right? So Arturo Escobar, Encountering Development, and there's Post-Development Reader and the Development Dictionary. The 1990s is also the peak time of neoliberalization. So actually after the 1970s crisis, and then it seems like it didn't really get better in the 1980s, even though there are more rhetoric on inclusive development and participatory development, and then you can see that there are a lot of criticism following those development too. So in the 1990s, there's some group of people, actually especially people from Latin America, because they are the descendants of dependency theorists, and they start to think that development is a failure. Like you can just keep innovating, but it is a failure. Maybe we should deconstruct development, right? So there's this a whole intellectual circle of post-development in the 1990s, even though it never get to the mainstream, and maybe most people never heard of it out of the academic circle. So one of the major ideas of post-development is that development is a mental construct. Development is a social construction, right? Development doesn't exist in itself. It is something that's being implanted in our mind, right? So we want to deconstruct it and look at what it actually is. So for example, when we talk about undeveloped countries or underdeveloping countries or least developed countries, we are not really talking about a particular characteristics of this country. Before the existence of developed country or the Western industrialized countries, before the encounter of the West and the rest of the world, there is no so-called developing countries or developing societies. In fact, countries itself only began in many parts of the world after decolonizations, right? So before that, it wasn't like based on a nation-state system. So developing societies only exist because developed societies exist. And you might have noticed that this is kind of more or less the approach that I was taking since the very beginning to tell you that you want to think about development as an idea, as an industry, so that we can really deconstruct it later. And I think throughout this class, we've been trying to deconstruct development, especially in part 1, but also part 2 as its impact on different people, right? And then one of the main arguments after deconstructing development is the argument that development is cultural imperialism. So it is a Western belief on how societies should function, should behave, and should achieve. That kind of standards are being imposed on the whole world. And it did instill material desire across the world, not in all kinds of society, but in many kinds of society. Most kind of society today desire material consumption. And it seems to be such a divide between this desire of high consumption with what we were talking about in the West about overconsumptions, garbage problem, or climate change, right? So the argument here is because since maybe the Truman time, there is a strong propagation that's integrated with political ideologies like democracy, capitalism, right? And I remember we have a very vibrant discussions about development as neocolonialism in the first week of our class. So I'm sure this is not a new argument for all of you. And then this third argument is also not something that's totally unfamiliar to us, right? When constructing development, the post-developmentalists say that development is implemented through seemingly non-political expert knowledge. So what it means by that is, so I can give you two examples here, and these two examples by anthropologists because I'm most familiar with the anthropological literature. Right, so the book on the left, James Ferguson, The Anti-Politics Machine, that was published in 1990. And what Ferguson was trying to say in this book is he looked at the country of Lesotho, especially on how Lesotho is represented in the World Bank documents and the other development agency documents. And he was arguing that the narrative can be replicated in many other countries, because the narrative is essentially saying that, oh, Lesotho has been a traditional society, it has been isolated from outside, so it hasn't had the chance to achieve modernization and technology. And this is so modernization theory, right? This is exactly what modernization theory would argue. But Ferguson said that if you look at the documents of many other countries, they're pretty much the same. And then, so what he was saying is that every time Lesotho is represented in this document, it always represented as a mere technical know-how thing. So as long as you follow this prescribed strategy, the country will achieve development. So in this case, he was saying that development is an anti-politics machine because it refused to talk about politics at all, right? But at the same time, it has real political effect because as development expand and reach more and more so-called rural or isolated areas, the power of the state to control the people becomes bigger and bigger. So it changes all the political landscape in places that development reaches, even though it is done in the name of non-political development. And the Will to Improve is was published 2007, so it's a relatively new book. But it also talks about very similar thing. It looks at how the will to improve is instilled among people, and she looked at Tanelli looked at what are the tools they are being used by development professionals to shape the desire of the local people, and also sometimes forcefully make them do something. So what is the proposition of post-developmentalists? So they are saying that instead of talking about development alternatives, such as participatory approaches, inclusive development, human development, sustainable development, which to them really indicates the different pathways to the same objective, which is development. Probably the development characterized by modernization theory, higher consumption, higher technological level, higher GDP. So instead of talking about different development alternatives, let's talk about alternatives to development. First of all, we should ditch the idea of development altogether, and look for an alternative way of organizing social lives and decolonizing knowledge system. So now I just want to take a break to look back at how development theories have evolved. So in the 1960s, remember we talk about a modernization theory, and these are the modernist people. Like they believe in the idea of progress, technology and trade and economic prosperity and growth, right? So these are the modernists. And then we have the structuralists. The structuralists are the dependency theories and the world system theories, talking about the world has power structure, and it is very difficult for country to move against the power structure. So the powerful will always be more and more powerful. And then we have the post-structuralists who didn't want to talk about this different power structure, but just want to reject the whole narrative of development.